Hello everyone, I welcome you all to this particular series where I am starting the sessions on understanding the C sharp language. I'm hoping that the audience here are those people who does not have any understanding on C sharp language. All right. So my objective here would be to help you understand what this language is about, to make you write the code. So how do I make you write the code is like I would be taking you through multiple lab sessions, which are the live sessions to make you very familiar on how the different topics work in C sharp. All right. So my objective here would be to lift you up um, and make you understand this programming language and to lift you up from basic to intermediate level, and then we would be also discussing the advanced concepts. All right, so this is the part one of C sharp technical series, and here we would be understanding what this programming language is all about. So the general question that arises in our mind when we think of any programming language is what the programming language is and what is the requirement of bringing that programming language. You all may have heard of multiple programming languages which are very prominent these days, whether it be C sharp or Java or JavaScript, Python, right? So now C sharp is one of the very prominent programming language, and it is known as the heart and soul of Microsoft. Now why do we call it as a heart and soul of Microsoft is because this particular programming language helps the developers to build Windows, web, mobile and cloud based applications. But the C sharp language, which is there present for all the developers today in the year 2020, is very different from the C sharp language which got evolved in the year 1999. So, in the year 1999, this gentleman from Microsoft, who happened to be the solution architect in Microsoft, Anders Hillsberg, he developed this particular programming language. Now, the question arises is what was the need of building a programming language in the year 1999 when there were many other languages prominent during that time? So, during that time in the year 1999, COBOL, Pascal, Fortran, these were the languages that were very much used across the developer community, right? So why Microsoft wanted to bring this particular language was one of the reason was there was already one language in market that was an object-oriented language, that was Java. Though, as I said, there were many procedural languages which were there in industry, but there was no object-oriented language from Microsoft. Now, why Microsoft required an object-oriented language over the procedural languages was because um, we humans tend to relate the real world entities around us in terms of objects. So anything that we see around us, whether it be the pen, book, laptop, they all are objects, right? So in the procedural oriented languages, the connection to real world entities was not really possible. So Microsoft wanted to come up with a true object oriented language where they could relate the real world entities, can bring their behaviors, can make the developer understand the different attributes. So they wanted to resemble a language which can purely be known as an object oriented language. So when we talk about the procedural languages, there you have uh, the programs which are procedure based. Procedures are basically the sequence of statements, sequence of programming lines. And the whole point of writing those programming lines is to do a function, which is also known as subroutine in procedural languages. But the whole point, as I said, of bringing this language, which was known as C Sharp, was that Microsoft wanted to have their own object oriented language, right? So we all know that C Sharp is one of the prominent languages these days, which is used to build a wide range of applications, and it's very robust, it's very secure, and you can see here on the screen also you have the support for the web applications like the browser support, and it's safe, it's secure. Now, how it is safe and how it is secure, that I would be discussing in my later slides. All right. Now, C Sharp also brings along very rich data type system. It's a type safe language. Now, what is this word type safe? So I'm hoping my audience does not know what type safe is also. So when we deal with the data, now data can be numbers or integers, or it can be characters, or it can be words, which are also known as strings. So all this data has their own types, and C Sharp is a language that can work with all these types, and it enforces almost all those types which other programming languages deal with. We will be discussing all this in detail while we move across our session further. So if somebody asks you what is C Sharp, so you should be able to answer C Sharp is an object-oriented programming language brought by Microsoft in the year 1999. It's one of the first object-oriented language from Microsoft. They wanted to have their own object-oriented language. And this language helps the developers build wide range of applications, whether it be the web, Windows, mobile, or cloud-based applications. All right. So basically, how the C Sharp program works is also very much important for us to understand. So the developer writes some code, some piece of code. As of now, you even don't know writing the code, considering the audience here for this session. Let's say you are writing just a single line of statement. All right. Now, what happens is when I consider it as a C sharp code, now I would be also making you understand how the program is written, and all those things later point of time. But at the moment, you understand that when the developer writes the C sharp code, it's the compiler of C sharp that reads and understands the code and identifies whether there are any errors or warnings available in the C sharp code. Okay, so this compiler is being provided by the makers of C sharp. It comes from the .NET framework. So at this moment, I'm hoping that you also don't know what the .NET framework is. So we'll just focus on the C sharp programming language at this moment. Now, the makers of C Sharp have provided a compiler that can read the C Sharp program and can understand whether there are any errors in the program or not. Once the program is free from any errors or warnings, the compiler will help you to transform your C Sharp code into intermediate language. Now, intermediate language is a language which is more English like language. So your C sharp compiler compiles your code and transforms it into the .exe file or the .dll file. This .exe file is basically an executable application. So you remember in our operating system, the most of the applications that we work on, which works on the launch and click methodology, They all are the executable applications. So executable applications can be built by the compiler by compiling the C sharp code. Similarly, if the requirement is just to build a dynamic link library, C sharp compiler can also do that. All right. So now what happens is the .NET framework also holds another compiler which is known as the just-in-time compiler, that is the JIT compiler. Now JIT compiler is able to read this English like language, which in simple words is known as intermediate language, and this language is also known as assembly language. So this language is being easily understood by the compiler, as the compiler is also this JID compiler is also known as assembler, and its all objective is to transform the IL code to the native code. So we all know that our operating system is just the software which is being installed on the machine, where machine is either the laptop or desktop or server machines. But the machines carry the motherboards, the processor, and your processor is only able to understand the binary language in the form of 0 and 1. Your processor does not understand the English like language, right? So it is this JIT compiler which transforms the intermediate language to the machine language, which is known as the native code language. All right. So if anybody asks you what happens to the C sharp code when it is compiled, so you should be able to answer that when a C sharp code is compiled, it becomes an executable application or a dynamic link library. And this is all being done by the C sharp compiler. And remember that this all activity happens during the compile time. When I say compile time, I mean to say that I'm not running my application. It's just the C sharp code, and my compiler is just compiling it, and my application is not being executed. All right. So this is being transformed into the IL code. And the IL code can only be understood by the JIT compiler. JIT compiler is also uh, it also comes from the .NET framework. It is able to read the assembly language so that it can be transformed to the native code, which is the binary language. So the moment the end user double clicks on the executable application, it's the JID compiler that tries to read the executable application and convey the messages to the microprocessor in the form of 0 and 1. And since all this activity happens during the runtime of the application, we call it a runtime process. All right. So this is how a C sharp program is executed. Now, those of us who do not know how to write a program or how to write a code, I may be helping you out with all of these. All right. But we need to understand that when we write the C sharp code, what happens there in the background. So when you write, say, a single line of code, your C sharp compiler is going to read and check the syntax of your code and understand whether there are any errors or not. If there are no errors, then your C sharp code is being converted into an exe or a DLL file. Now this is the same exe or DLL file. This is the same exe which is also known as executable application. You can just double click and launch it. All right. And DLL files, these are the dynamic link libraries. They are not the executable application, but they can be referenced by other applications. Okay. We would be discussing about DLL in detail in our later sessions. At the moment, you just understand that your C sharp code is being compiled into an exe or a DLL file. Exe file are the executables and DLL are the dynamic link library. So you are able to run the executable applications. You can just launch them, and then the JIT compiler, which is a part of the .NET framework, it tries to read your executable file to transform it into a native code which can only be understood by the processor. All right. So this is the flow that you should be able to understand and remember, and should be able to tell to anyone who asks you how a C sharp program is executed. Now, those of us who do not know writing the C sharp program, at least we should be able to understand making a flowchart first. So, how the programs got evolved was like, um, they got evolved from pseudocode and the flowchart. So at least the people who are not the developers here and want to learn C sharp, they should be able to understand the basic structure of a flowchart and should be able to build a flowchart. So here I have brought a flowchart for you where we are doing an addition of two numbers. Now, when I ask somebody how do you add two numbers, the answer would be you take a, you take a variable a, you take another variable b, and do the addition operation a plus b, and you get the result c. That is correct. But in a flowchart, just the operation may not matter. There are other things also that matters, like um, reading the input a, then reading the input b, then doing the operation on a plus b, and then printing the result, which is c, and then ending of your program. So in flowchart, the start and end, they are being represented by ellipses, as you can see. And you can see the rectangle which denotes your operation. The inputs are being denoted through, parallelograms. So what is now, if we look into this particular operation, which is addition of two numbers, and just try to summarize what we are doing. So first we are getting a variable a. All right. Now what is this variable? We would be understanding it, but if this is confusing you, I would say we are getting a from the user, then we are getting b from the user, then we are trying to perform an addition on a plus b to get c, and then we are displaying the result c to the user, and then we are closing our program. All right. So this is a very basic flowchart, and even the non-programmers should be able to write this. Now, we would be understanding what happens in the C sharp when we try to write a program. All right. But before writing our first program in C sharp, it is very much essential to understand how the data is being stored and treated in the C sharp programming language. All right. So here in this particular case, you can see that A may have some data in it, B may have some data in it, and then we are trying to perform an addition on the data of A and B to get the result, which is again stored in C. All right. So in C sharp, the data can be stored in variables. All right. So variable is the keyword. Variable is the word which is being used to denote the data representation. All right. So now how these variables work is like, say your requirement is to store the age of an individual. Now when I say age of an individual, the age is basically an integer number. All right. So you say age int. All right. Now we would be discussing about all of these. I do not want to confuse you, but the whole point of bringing this slide is just to make you very comfortable and understand what the variable are. All right. So before we come back to this slide, I just want to take you that if you want to write your first C Sharp program, where would you go? All right. So if you want to try from your home, you can go to the online IDE. IDE stands for Integrated Development Environments. They are the websites where you can practice your C Sharp program. Once you are thorough with understanding the C Sharp, you can try installing the offline IDEs like Visual Studio and can run your C Sharp programs. So, considering we are at a very initial step and at a very foundation level, I am going to take you to the online IDE now, and then in our later sessions, I will take you to Visual Studio. All right, so you can just search .NET Fiddle. All right, so this is a .NET Fiddle, and this helps you to write your first C Sharp program. You can see C Sharp language, and it uses the .NET framework, and the compiler comes from the .NET framework that speeds your program. Okay, you can just do something like you can remove all of these. Or if you don't want to remove all of these, you can just remove the text here and here. Now, why I have removed all of the text and have just left this piece of text is because I want to make you understand what variables are. Now, I'm hoping as of now we do not know what C Sharp program is. So again, I do not want to confuse you here. We would just be focusing on what the variables are, and then we would be understanding our first C Sharp program. But before we discuss on the C Sharp program and I take you to our first program, I want you to understand the variable. So I will just open the notepad. Yeah, so I was talking about age of an individual, right? Okay. So if you have to store the age of an individual, age is a number. All right. So in C Sharp, the numeric inputs are being considered through a type of data which is known as integers, and integers are being written as int. So you can store the age of an individual like this. All right. And then you have to keep a terminator for the compiler to understand that you are storing the value 10 to a variable, and the name of the variable is age, and the type of the variable is int. Okay, if you want to store the name of an individual, you can do that also. So I say John, and in C sharp we have another keyword which is used to consider the string variables. So here the variable name is name, and this is of the type string. It is able to take the string inputs. String is basically a sequence of characters. So here character is JOHN, and string values are being assigned in double quotes. All right. Then you have another types also. We would be discussing all of them in detail, but at the moment, I just want to make you very comfortable with the basic types, and then I will take you to this particular slide again. So I was talking about that you have the variable name in C sharp, you have the data type that represents the type of the data, then you store a value, and then you put a terminator. So the syntax of variable in C sharp is basically a data type and the variable name. All right. So if you want to store any number, numeric values, you have to use the int types, and you do like this: int age. comma number. And so basically here we are creating two variables, age and number, to store the different values. Similarly, if you want to store, the character values, you can do like that also. um, Floating numbers you can do like this, and numbers with higher ranges you can use the double. I would be taking you to a detailed chart where we would be discussing all the data types, but at this moment the whole point of bringing this slide is just to make you very comfortable what variable is. So what happens is when we assign any value to a variable, the compiler can only understand the variable once you define its data type, and then your compiler in the background stores that value in your random access memory. All right. So you can see some of the examples here, like value, how it is being assigned to the variable. So you have a word here, basically a string, which is the sequence of characters which is being assigned to the variable, where the variable is a name. Okay, so here the variable names are age, which is of int type, name, which is of string type, language, which is of character type, and max, it's another variable name which is of float type. All right, so when we assign the values to the variable, those variable, we call them as variable initialization. All right, and when you do not assign the value to your variable, you just define them, we call it as variable definition. So if somebody asks you how do you define a variable, okay, so let's say I have to take the I have to ask the roll numbers from students. All right, so I would say roll number. Okay, now roll number is an integer value, so I would say int. So this is my variable name, and this is the type of my variable, and I would just say terminator. So this is basically the variable definition. Now when I assign the value to my variable, all right, say 25. So this is known as variable initialization. All right. Now I could have done like this also, but considering I've already defined my variable, I do not want to use int. Okay. So similarly, you also have an advantage to declare, multiple variables at a time. You can define them in a multiple way. You can say roll number, then date of birth, then you can say their name. All right, so you can do all of them and can assign the value also. Okay, I would say 08. All right, name, I would say so. This is how we define variables in C sharp, and this is how we initialize the variable in C sharp. Now why do we require the variables is because we need the compiler to understand where we will actually store the data. All right, so while we were doing the calculation of two numbers, as I said, we were just adding the two numbers, but in C sharp the compiler will have to store the values of two numbers somewhere in the memory, which is the random access memory, right? So in order to do that, the developer should create the variables. So how do we do that? We would say the first variable is a, and this would take type of integer values, and then you have b, the variable name, which will take the values of int types, and then you would require another variable that can store your result, right? So you would do something like a plus b. So now your C would be able to store the values of a plus b. All right. So the whole point of making you understand what variable is that variables are able to store the values which are being um, assigned by the developers, right? Okay, so let me take you to the next now. Yeah. So I told you that the syntax of variable is basically the data type followed by variable name, right? And if you want to initialize the variable, you would give the value. So data type, variable name, and you'll assign the value and you would use the equal to. So you have these keywords which I already discussed, and this is how we would initialize the variables. Let's say you want to assign the value 10 to a variable whose name is number, you would do like this. Let's say you'd want to assign the value named as Suresh the Sari to the variable name, you would do like this. And let's say you want to assign some decimal value, you can use the double type and you can do like this. Similarly, you want to assign a single character, you can do like this. And similarly, if you want to assign a boolean value, true or false, you can do like this. Now, in C sharp, when we want to print the values, we use console.writeLine. I will be discussing about console.writeLine and readline all in detail, but at this moment, you just should focus on, till here, till this part where you should be able to write a variable and you should be able to initialize them. So if somebody asks us, how do you define a variable? All right. So we would say uh, the name of the variable, that is variable name, and the type of the variable, followed by the terminator. So I would say if I want to store the employee ID of an employee, I would say employee ID, and this employee ID will be an integer value, so I would say int employee ID, right? So this is basically defining a variable. If somebody asks you, how do you initialize a variable? So initialization would happen like, you can assign some value, let's say 5200. All right. So hope we are very clear, and let's move on from here. So C Sharp provide us the wide range of variables, a wide range of variable types, which are the data types. So the types start from byte. Byte is a very basic data type that C Sharp offers, and byte is composed of 8 bits of data, and followed it can only take the value that range from 0 to 255. Okay. Then you have the signed byte, which is denoted by S byte. It can take the values ranging from minus 128 to 127. Then you have uh, int 32, which is the signed integer, which can only take the value ranging from this particular integer value to this particular integer value. Then you have unsigned integer, which can take the value from 0 to this particular value. All right. So unsigned integer is composed of 32 bits. Signed integer is also composed of 32 bits. The difference between signed and unsigned integer is basically the range of values. So unsigned integer, you can see here, takes all the positive values starting from 0 to here, while signed integer considers all the values from this particular number to this particular number. All right. Uh, then you can see that there are some other types also, and the difference between all these integer types is basically the range of values which they take. Okay. So it's on the developer to use the types which they want to, but we should always remember that these data types, they consume these many bits of memory. All right. If you are going to use unsigned integer, your compiler will consume 64 bit of memory, which is fairly more than 8 or 32 or 16 bits of memory. All right. So it is all on the basis of requirement, what number you want to store. Okay. So we would be seeing a live example here. I would be taking you to the lab and will show you to make you more understand on the data types. But at this moment, you understand that we have these range of types available in C sharp. Similarly, you have the other types also like float, double, character, bool, object, string, and decimal. Float considers the decimal values, the floating point values that ranges from this number to this number. Similarly, double again is it considers the floating point value, but the difference between float and double is basically the bits of memory which they consume. So you can see the range which is available for float and double. Now character, uh, it is the type which is used to take the single character. It consumes Unicode of memory. And when I say Unicode, I mean to say it consumes 16 bits of memory. All right. The other type which is available in C sharp is bool, which considers the boolean values. It takes 8 bit of memory and you can assign values as true or false. All right. So now let us go to our .NET Fiddle, and we would be, trying to see all these integers, and we'll try to see and understand whether they are able to uh, take the values or not. All right. So you can see here, let us pick one value. So what we can see here is, consider this U short. All right. So U short type, this type can only take the values from 0 to 65535. All right. 65,535. All right. So this unsigned integer can only take the value from 0 to 65,535. Now, what if I assign a negative value to unsigned integer? Can it be able to take? Let's see. So what I'm going to do now, let us not focus on all of these because we don't know so far. I have not discussed the first program of C sharp. We just need to focus here. All right. So first I'm going to declare a variable. So how do I do that? I would say um, my variable name, that is I'm giving the variable name as number. And what is that which I'm going to keep as a type here? I'm going to keep the type here as U short. All right. And I'm going to assign number, say 10. Okay. Now you can see that my compiler has, I'll remove these namespaces also. I'll remove all the unnecessary things to make the things easy for you. So I'm going to declare and initialize a variable named num. This is the name of my variable. And when I'm printing this, in order to print the variables, you can use console.writeLine. I'm going to discuss console.writeLine in detail, but at the moment you just need to understand that console.writeLine is used to print the values in C sharp. And then we'll keep a terminator and then we'll run this. So guys, you are able to see that we are able to print the value as 10. Okay, my variable is num and I am printing the num and I'm getting the value as 10. Now we understood that ushort can take values from 0 to 655. What is that range? 65535. Okay, this is the range it can take. So it's able to take the value as 10 because it's very comfortable, and the makers of C sharp has defined a range of value for this particular type. Now when I give the value as -10, it starts giving me error. The compiler recognizes that we cannot assign a negative value to ushort. Okay, so it cannot be converted to a ushort, and when I run this, I'm hoping that I get a compilation error. So this tells us that all of these types, they have their own range defined for them. So for the basic programmers, they should be able to at least memorize this particular chart and should know that when we are assigning the values and we want to save our memory, it is for the developers to make a decision on what particular type they want to use. All right. If your value is very small, say 10, then you need not use a very big unsigned integer which consumes 64 bit of memory. Though your value 10 can be stored in this type, but it will consume 64 bit of memory. On the other hand, you have other integers, unsigned and signed. All the signed integers, they have negative values to the positive values. All the signed integers, you would see, sorry, so what I want to say here is all the signed integer, they have negative to positive values, and all the unsigned integer, they have 0 to positive values. So when I wanted to store the number 10 and wanted to print it, I could have used byte as an integer because it just consumes 8 bit of memory and it can store 0 to 255 bits, right? That's fairly good enough. So let us try. So I can make, say, byte, and so my compiler is able to accept it. Now byte can only accept values from 0 to 255, but the moment I make it 256, it starts giving me error, right? So the whole point of showing this to you is to make you understand that when you are trying to assign values to your variable, if the value falls in this range and your value is small, try to go in this particular hierarchy. Okay, and if your value is very large, or there are chances that in the near future your value may turn up to be very large, in those cases only you should be able to use a typically large value. All right, so just memorize the types that we have understood. Byte, integers are composed of signed integers and unsigned integers. Then we have float, we have double, character, boolean, object, string, decimal. We would be going through the live examples of each and every type in our, coming sessions. Um, just remain very comfortable. So the whole point of this particular session was just to make you familiar with the C Sharp programming language. So in the C Sharp programming language, session one, what we have understood the history of C Sharp. We learned that why C Sharp was brought by Microsoft in the year 1999. We also understood how a C Sharp program is executed. We learned that how a flowchart can be considered. I'm very bad at typing while writing a program. We also understood about the intermediate language in C Sharp and native code. Then we understood about variables. We understood that variables can be defined and initialized. All right. So variables are the one which store data, and in order to define variable, we should give them data types. Then we understood the different data types. We also understood the different signed and unsigned integers. All right. So in this particular session, my objective was just to make you familiar with C Sharp and make you familiar with the the variables and to make you understand how the C Sharp program works. So guys who are very new to C Sharp, please remember this particular chart. It's very important. You should be familiar with the names like byte, int for integer, short for signed integer, long, float, double, char, bool, object string. Okay, so now remember that we still have not written our first program. All right, so in the next session, we would be understanding how do we write the first C sharp program. All right. But we also need to understand a few more things before we write our first C sharp program. So I would recommend you all to stay tuned to the next sessions. And I'm pretty hopeful that you have understood so far in this session these many topics. And you can practice uh, creating, declaring, and initializing the variables with the different types on .NET Fiddle at a very basic level. All right. So thank you so much. Stay tuned and follow the next sessions on C